The following podcast is taken from a live broadcast on Inspire FM.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the book club show on Inspire 105.1 FM. My name is Imrana Mahmood and today is the 26th of September and it's just turned 10 o'clock. I hope you have had a wonderful morning so far. It is a little bit wet, and to be honest, I was about to say, to be honest, that means that autumn is kind of creeping up, but obviously we are in the UK. The rain is kind of part of our lives here, but still, I did see the sun sneak out for a little while a bit earlier on, so maybe we still have a little bit of summer left. Anyway, I am really delighted to be bringing you an exciting show this morning. I am joined by a wonderful award-winning author, and we are going to be talking about her book, which is called The Things That We Lost. So this is by Jyoti Patel, and it's been an absolute delight reading it. There's lots of different themes that are covered within this novel, including kind of family relationships and grief and love and loss and longing. There's so much covered, and Jyoti writes in a really, really beautiful way. So as always, I'm going to read the blurb of the book, and then we're going to hopefully have Jyoti on the show with us this morning. Not in the studio today, but in the virtual studio. So we'll be talking to her over online. So today the show is The Things That We Lost, and the blurb is: Nick has lots of questions about his late father, but knows better than to ask his mother, Avani. It's their unspoken rule. When his grandfather dies, Nick has the opportunity to learn about the man he never met. Armed with a key and new knowledge about his parents' past, Nick sets out to unlock the secrets that his mother has been holding onto his whole life. As the carefully crafted portrait Avani has painted for her son begins to crack and painful truths emerge, can the two of them find their way back to each other? So The Things That We Lost is a beautifully tender exploration of family loss and how far we will go to protect the ones we love. So that is the debut book by Jyoti Patel, and I'm really delighted that we'll be having her on the show this morning. And what's really actually exciting is later on, for those of you know, I also run a women's only book club in Luton, so she will be joining us later on this evening because we are actually celebrating 9 years of our book club. So there's lots of kind of exciting things going on there, which is fantastic. And I think it's really, the whole point of the show is that we're able to celebrate underrepresented writers, that we're able to hopefully get ourselves into the love of reading. And that was always the aim of the show, to rekindle our love of reading, to really inspire, hopefully, younger readers and actually adult readers as well, because I think that a lot of the time we do spend getting busy. If we're parents or carers, our routines get busy with bringing up the next generation, I guess. But also sometimes we're busy with work or some errands, or there's always some sort of, other kind of responsibilities that we will always carry. But obviously we do know when it comes to reading, it is definitely a really important part of our health and well-being. One of the main, I guess, really positive outcomes of reading is that sense of empathy, because books really do take you on a journey. They take you to various different places and spaces. I can't remember who said the quote, but they said that, books are a way that you're kind of able to travel, because you really are transported to different eras, and there's so much always that's going on. It's really, really wonderful that we've got Jyoti on the show this morning. I think we are just trying to sort of a little bit out in the background just to hopefully get her this morning on the phone. So yeah, you can just bear with us there. So as I said, there is lots going on in terms of the things that we lost, in terms of the themes that are covered. And what's really great is, I think, as kind of the South Asian diaspora, it's really important that we are able to kind of talk about these different themes, and really that we're able to work, I guess, where we all are and where we find ourselves. So I'm just going to basically hopefully have Jyoti on the line. I'm going to ask Brother Tariq to come into the studio and help me get this set up, because I cannot right now see how to bring Jyoti on. So just bear with us there.
Hi, Imrana. I think I'm on already. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes. You know what? I was still waiting for something to do with Zoom, but no, we're all good. Thank you. Hi. Good morning, Jyoti.
Good morning. Sorry, I didn't know whether to interrupt you or not.
No, that is so sweet. That is so sweet of you that you didn't, and I was just going to carry on until somebody gave me. But thank you so much for joining us this morning. Let me give you a proper introduction, and then we can kind of delve straight into the show. So Jyoti Patel was born in Paris to British Indian parents and grew up in northwest London. She is a graduate of the University of East Anglia's Prose Fiction MA and winner of the 2021 Murky Books New Writers Prize. Her writing has previously been published as part of We Present's Literary series and in the anthology for the 2022 Bristol Short Story Prize, for which she was shortlisted. Things That We Lost is her debut novel. So thank you so much, Jyoti, for joining us this morning. I guess we can kind of delve straight in, and maybe for our listeners, just to find out what your journey has been like up to this point. Of obviously your debut book has been out now, but how it was in the run up to that.
Yeah, so I always wanted to write. I studied English for my undergrad at university, and then sort of stopped writing just because I sort of was very aware of how hard it is to actually get published. And so I sort of like put the dream aside, had a career in marketing. And then I think it was around 2017, 2018, I started writing again very suddenly, like unexpectedly. And it was a conversation between a British Gujarati grandson and grandfather. And that became the first chapter of the Things That We Lost. So I went back to university, did a master's at the UEA, which was incredible. And at that time, I really worked on the novel, and I really sort of, I basically went to uni with 50 or 60,000 words of it written, and I came out with about 12,000 words intact.
Right.
I basically started from scratch, and I learned so much on that course. And then it was maybe even, I think, like a couple of weeks after I got my results that I applied for the Murky Books New Writers Prize with, I think it was chapter 3. From the start of the novel,
right.
Where one of the characters, Avani, is at the banks of the river Ganga with her son Nick, and she's performing the final rites for her father, who's the grandfather that I mentioned earlier. And I won the Murky Books New Writers Prize. I submitted the chapter in must have been about October, November, won in, I think it was April of 2021. And then, the book came out in January this year. I spent between April 2021 and January this year sort of working on it, editing it. It's a long process in publishing. So that's my journey in a nutshell.
No, and it sounds amazing. And actually, I'm absolutely in awe that you were able to do this and be, studying and, all the things that go on when we're kind of at that age. So that's really amazing. And actually, could you just give us a little bit more information on what the Murky Books kind of prize is and where that's kind of come from, and I guess what platform that's giving writers as well?
Yeah, definitely. So Murky Books is an imprint with Penguin. So it's like a little section of Penguin, basically. And it was set up between Stormzy and Penguin in order to really champion untold stories. So traditionally, publishing has got a very certain type of reputation. And I think there's been a lot recently in the last sort of 5 to 10 years to try and change that and to try and change the way that British bookshelves look, just because there hasn't always been a lot of representation of different groups within the UK on bookshelves. So Murky Books is very much like trying to change the mainstream and trying to create space on British bookshelves for stories that would otherwise go untold. So the New Writers Prize, when I applied, it was open to 16 to 30-year-olds. I think that might have been tweaked. And it was, it was open to writers who didn't have agents, who weren't published, and who were very much at the beginning of their journey. And it was to give these writers like a chance at being published, essentially, and their stories, which might not otherwise be picked up, a chance to, to be published. So that was very much the case with mine. It's a story set in Northwest London where I grew up. It's a British Gujarati mother and son. There's lots of like Gujarati words in it. There's lots of sort of the Gujarati culture in it. And it was something that, again, I hadn't really seen before. So yeah, it fit the sort of remit of the prize quite well. And the prize is open every year. So I'd encourage anyone who's sort of unagented, unpublished, who's a budding writer, to definitely go and check it out. It's called the Murky Books New Writers Prize.
Yeah, and when we talk about representation, especially when it comes to kind of literature and publishing, of course it's so important, and so much of it resonated because I grew up in Northwest London. So when you were speaking about Neasden, I went to school in Neasden. You were talking about IKEA. I think I worked there for about 6 months. Getting myself through university, and it was something so. I think it was just so lovely about that because, the more I guess we are getting British South Asian writers on bookshelves, like you've said, that's the thing, is the power of being able to be seen and have our experiences be just platformed and celebrated that way, I think is really beautiful. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for writing the things that we lost. And I guess the thing is that you cover so much, which is, again, it's a testament, I think, to you yourself as a writer. So, as we mentioned, you talk about family relationships. So you've got, obviously, Nick and his grandfather. You then have Avni with her mother. Avni, obviously the fact that she's, with her partner, etc. So there's a lot that's covered there. Friendships. I mean, obviously, I guess I could go on with a list, but I guess my question was, how did you navigate your creative writing process? Because it is kind of important subject matter, but obviously you also want to write in a nuanced way as well. Yeah,
it's a really good question, actually, because I started writing this book, like I say, I can't remember the exact date, but it was probably around 2018, let's say. And it was published in 2021. And I spent all of that time with the characters. And even though I'd have big chunks of the time, maybe like 6 months where I wasn't even, looking at the novel. And then I'd spend a few months on it, put it down again, pick it up again. Even though I wasn't writing every day, I had the characters with me and I was thinking about them and their relationships. And during those years, like their relationships and their histories, there was so much texture and so many layers being added to their stories, even though I wasn't actually writing. And I think that's what lends itself to what you're talking about, like the way that the intergenerational dynamics and the family feel very real, because the characters were just with me so long, and I would be thinking about them even if I wasn't writing, and, wondering what they're up to. And there were many, you asked a little bit about process. There are many chapters in the novel which didn't actually make it through, where I just wanted to say, for example, if I put these two characters in a room, what would happen? Or there's a chapter written from Nick's perspective. If I looked at that from Avni, his mother's perspective, what would it look like? So you do all these things as a writer that don't actually make their way down to the page, but all of that sort of background work is so important for then creating a multi-generational sort of family within the pages of the book that feel really real. And I did want them to all feel very real. A lot of people say, oh, look, are they based on people or your family? But my family are like the opposite of the one in this novel. I wanted them to feel like real, but then very much, fictional. And it was really fun sort of creating them. And it was I think lots of debut authors, if anyone's listening who is a debut author, will relate to this. But it's a really strange feeling when you've spent so long with these characters and then you're just finished and you're just like, oh God, I have to leave them alone now. So it was really fun sort of being with them for that long.
No, and I really love what you said about textures, because it gives it this really, I guess, it's just that reality of how you can really delve into like another person's life, and and again, in a really, really layered way. So I think that's really interesting and also to see how, I guess, your own thinking works as a writer, and it's true, because I've spoken to various authors in the past as well, and there's that thing of, yes, I had a whole stretch of absolutely writing, and then there was a big stretch of I didn't touch it at all, but you're right, it's that kind of invisible time that where you like you said, you're still thinking about the characters, because you need to obviously have that whole trajectory, isn't it, of a character, which I think is really really great to actually know. So I guess kind of delving a bit more into the book and some of the themes that you tackle, quite early-ish in the book, there's a mention of like the Union Jack, and how the character, so this is Avni when she's younger, I think she's with her brother, and how identity, I guess, is portrayed, and how maybe whether we do or don't have a sense of belonging when we see that flag. So why was it important for something like that for you to kind of include in the novel itself as well?
Yeah, that's a lovely question. So it's, the genre of the book, it sits within contemporary realism, which means that it's a novel that unfolds. It's supposed to, the aim is for it to unfold the way real life would. It's meant to feel like real life. And I really wanted to touch on themes of identity, race, belonging in a way that would feel real, as in it's a reflection of how you would go about your daily life, and then have a sudden microaggression, or there's something where you can't quite articulate, but you feel uncomfortable. So I wanted to basically set the two timelines as well. So Avni, the mother, she's growing up in Harrow in like the 70s and 80s. And then we flip between her growing up and then Nick, her son, growing up in 2017, 2018. And I wanted to set the narrative in those two specific moments of history, because I wanted to look at what was going on in the 70s with the NF and the sorts of racism that were playing out in the 70s, and then juxtapose that with that very specific pocket of time we had in the UK in between the Brexit referendum and Brexit actually happening in 2017, 2018, where there seemed to be this huge surge in like xenophobia that was bubbling under the surface and then came out. So coming back to the flags, I look at early in the novel when we're in 1970s, the late 1970s, Avni's a kid and she's with her brother, and they see the Union Jack, which at the time was, very much tied to what was going on with the NF, the National Front. And then again, later in the novel, there's a moment when Nick feels uncomfortable seeing the St. George's flag, which again, was taken by the EDL and the BNP. And there are these undertones of there are these undertones to the flags, the two different flags at two different points in history. And I wanted to just look at, very subtly and quietly, look at what that feels like when you're a brown or black person in the UK, and you're in, for example, like a very white space, or you're away from, the multiculturalism of Northwest London, and to see the weight of what those symbols sort of hold, and the way that they have been sort of taken, and they sort of quietly say something more than just representing a country now. And it's very quietly done, there's not paragraphs and paragraphs about how the characters feel when they see these things. It's just subtly there, because that's the way it exists in real life. We'll go for a walk in the countryside and see a St. George's flag in a pub and think, hold on, should I go to the next pub, or should I go to that one? So yeah, I hope that answers your question, but that's a little bit of the background of why I set the narrative in these two timeframes, and what I was trying to do with, the contemporary realism, and then the sort of the quiet nods at what it's like to be brown or black in white spaces.
Yeah, no, and thank you for sharing that as well, because I think those parallels, because of the dual timelines, is really, really kind of effective. And I think, a sense of, like you said, because they're microaggressions, and you've touched upon it in a very kind of micro level, but that is so, because I think it does a really important kind of job, because I was reading and thinking, I've experienced this so many times. And, you've captured, at one point, Nick experiences, it is literally a racist incident. And you capture his emotions and feelings kind of really in a very visceral way. Like I could really feel it within me as I was reading it. And how was that then for you? So how are you? Because the other things you also write about is, for example, the relationship between Avni and her mother. Is quite abusive, quite toxic, and that was quite difficult to read. So I guess I was thinking how it was for you to write these, and what time I guess you were taking for yourself to process it. Because I can imagine it must be quite difficult to write as well.
Yeah, it is, and it's interesting because when you're writing, you're talking about writing just before I came on, and I think you were touching a little bit on like the empathy and how to read is an act of empathy, really, to be able to live in someone else's world and feel and understand things that you might never experience, but you feel them viscerally, like you're saying. And to write also is an act of empathy because you're trying so hard to get into the mindset. I'm in the mindset when I was writing this novel of a 45-year-old widow mother and an 18-year-old son, and I'm neither of those things. I'm neither a mother nor a son, but I had to really get into the mindsets of those characters. And it's the same when I was writing the difficult chapters with Avni and her mother, and I was writing the difficult chapters of Nick, who really struggles with his mental health when he leaves London for university, and he feels extremely isolated. He's grieving for his grandfather. He's suddenly confronted with the fact that he's a brown person in a white space. It wasn't the most jolly of times for me as a writer to get into those mindsets. But you're right, I did have to step away a little bit and take time to process and to find the line between like transposing something onto the page that felt very real and that would feel very real to the reader, but then also trying to remember, okay, this is actually just fiction. Like it hasn't actually happened, even though I had to live through it in my head in order to write about it. So it's an interesting space to be in, and I don't know if it will be relatable to anyone who's not an author or creative, but it's a very niche sort of feeling to have gone through something fictionally in order to write about it in a realistic way, but then you haven't actually gone through it, that exact thing. But the things that Nick experiences, like you were just saying, you related to some of the microaggressions and stuff. I think it was really important for me, even though it's, like I say, a piece of fiction, lots of the things that he does feel and he does experience are things that I went to university in a very, very white town, and I, for the first time in my life, like Nick, was experiencing microaggressions and overt racism, and I was so confused because I'd grown up in northwest London, and I didn't realise that there were parts of, pockets of England that was still quite xenophobic in ways, or that, when you went out to the countryside, sometimes these things did happen. So that's something that I tried to put into the book, and, something that you touched on. These feelings of, when you've come from quite a multicultural place and then you find yourself somewhere that isn't, the way that you have to code switch and navigate those spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, obviously, that there is a bit where you kind of talk about a little bit about code switching as well. But I was just going to come back to, obviously, the fact that the things that we lost, your debut book, that obviously you've included things like racism and kind of, everything that's going on socio-politically, almost like a mirror, holding up a mirror to the UK. Were you at any point slightly concerned about how audiences might kind of receive the book? Because I guess in some ways you are holding up, or you're kind of delving into complex relationships, like you said, in the South Asian or, particularly British Gujarati, like families. But then also this idea of the UK, potentially pockets of the UK, obviously still being very, very like racist. So yeah, I guess I was thinking about your thoughts of how the book might be received.
It was interesting. I had a bit of a wobble about it just before the book came out because I thought, oh God, people are actually going to have to read this now. And I, like you touched on there, it's very much a realistic look. It's one look, but it's a realistic look at what it's like to be a British Gujarati family moving through the UK. And like you touched on there, I talk about the microaggressions and the belonging and the identity and the constant sort of feeling, do I belong here? Am I British? Am I Indian? I look at also the family, like I mentioned, the chapter I submitted for the Merky Books New Writers Prize. They go to India, to the Ganga, to the river Ganga, to perform the final rites. And there, both of the characters are like, we're in India where we're told we belong to, but we don't feel like we're part of India because they see us as British. And when we're in Britain, we're seen as Indian. So there's always these in-between spaces. But coming back to your question, I look at not just what it's like to be a brown person in the UK and these specific, like you say, very like charged moments in history, but I also very much tried to portray a realistic look at what it's like to be a Gujarati family in the UK and some of the problems that come with that. You know, there's a lot of anti-blackness in the South Asian community, which I've spoken about before. You know, I look at colorism in the book. I look at these things within the Gujarati and South Asian communities that often we don't want to talk about, because I felt like in order to write a contemporary realist novel, in order for it to be real, I wanted to be truthful. So yeah, I was worried when the book came out, because there were so many people in the Gujarati community and the South Asian community who were really excited about it, because they were going to see representation and they were going to see a British Gujarati family within the folds of a book. But what comes with that is the truth. And there's so many beautiful parts of being Gujarati and South Asian, but I also wanted to hold the community to account and to be like, we're great and we do all these beautiful things, but we also have these deeply rooted problematic views about colorism and anti-blackness and these things. So they're also subtly, quietly in the novel too. Because I didn't want to portray just one side of it. I wanted to show a very realistic, truthful portrayal.
And I think, you've done that really, really well. And, I think, again, just to commend you for being able to do that and be brave. And thank God, that the book is out there. We are heading to a break, so we'll be back shortly in a few moments to continue talking to Jyoti Patel about the things that we lost.
Assalamu alaikum, this is Atif Nawaz. Listen to Inspire FM shows in your time by heading over to inspirefm.org or listen on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to the Book Club show on Inspire 105.1 FM. My name is Imrana Mahmood and it's just gone 10:30 on the 26th of September. And on the show, I am delighted to be joined by Jyoti Patel, and we are discussing her debut book, The Things That We Lost. Jyoti is the winner of the Merky Books New Writers Prize. And in the first half of the show, we were talking about some of the themes of the book, which include family, love, loss, grief. There's a lot covered in this book and I really, really enjoyed reading it. We also spoke a little bit about the importance of representation on British bookshelves and giving a platform for untold stories. So we're going to carry on the conversation with Jyoti because she is joining us on the studio, well, the kind of online studio, so to speak. Good morning and welcome back, Jyoti.
Thank you so much.
So maybe if we just carry on the conversation. So just before the break, I asked you how you were kind of feeling about having this book out in the world, especially because you are tackling some quite, difficult, I guess, subject matter, which is really holding the mirror up to, I guess, our own communities as well as, wider UK society as well. But how, maybe moving on, how has it been now that the book has been out there and how has it been received and what's it been like, maybe attending different events and just describe that for us.
Yeah, it's been a really lovely year because it came out in January. So it's been like basically the whole of this year has just been like enjoying finally having it out and seeing it on bookshelves and speaking at festivals. And the thing that's been the most exciting, I think, is meeting readers at book clubs and at events. It's been really lovely to meet people who've read it and who've enjoyed it and to have conversations about how what they thought about it. I think a lot of people who are authors, myself definitely, write for connection. I always say I wrote this book to connect up the different parts of my past and to make connections between myself and how I fit into the world and to process that through the act of writing fiction, but also to connect with other people. So that's been the most special part of it all is just meeting readers and speaking to them about the book and seeing how it's like impacted them. It's been very beautiful, yeah.
And that's so nice. And I did mention in the introduction in the first half of the show, obviously you'll be joining our book club this evening in Luton. So obviously we're all really, really excited about that. And I guess, how has it been in that case? Because obviously you're I guess the book is out there, but what about like your kind of closest people to you? What have they said about it, and how's their support, I guess, got you through? Because that's the other thing, really, because as British Asians, this type of career, I mean, I know things are changing potentially now, but back in the days, you know, it was that stereotypical thing of doctor, engineer, lawyer, etc. So yeah, I guess, you know, how's that kind of side of things been for you?
Yeah, it's a good question, actually. I definitely do think things are changing now. I look at like my little cousins and my nieces and stuff, and it feels like they have, you know, I could be wrong, but it seems to me like they have much broader sort of access to the arts now, because, you know, I'm of the generation where my parents moved here in the 70s and 80s from Kenya, much like the family in the book. They're Gujaratis in Britain via East Africa. And, you know, every time they moved, they sort of had to start from scratch when they went from India to Kenya and then Kenya to the UK. And I think my parents moved here when they were sort of teenagers. And so I'm, I guess, second generation, even though technically, I mean, I was born in Paris, but then we moved back to the UK. So it's a bit confusing. And I know the whole generation thing doesn't really make sense anyway. But my parents were very much like here when they were teenagers. And I think now the generations underneath me, I still had that sort of thing from my parents of like, I have to have a career that's going to mean that I can earn money, and I don't have the luxury of just being able to take a couple of years out to write a novel or, you know, things like this. So, which is why, you know, coming back to the start of our conversation, I studied English, but then I threw myself into a career in marketing because I needed to live. And it was only when I sort of found a good rhythm with that and I was like financially stable that I thought, okay, I can pull back now and go and do a master's and start writing again. So it wasn't, I mean, I don't think my parents were jumping for joy when as a 16-year-old I said I want to go and study English at university. I was the first person that I know of in my whole family to ever study an art at university. My parents and my family, they were all in like tech and medicine. And so I don't think it was the easiest conversation, but I'm really glad I did it. And I'm glad that I stood my ground, and I had a really brilliant English teacher at school who told my mum, like, no, she can be a writer, like she's very good. Which really helped. So it wasn't the easiest path for me, but my parents were incredibly supportive when I did just say, this is what I'm going to do. They sort of got over it. And then now they're just, very, very proud, I think, to see that the novel's out. And also that I've written a novel about, you know, about the community and the British Gujarati life. And, you know, in a way, even though it's fiction, a story that mirrors their journey of coming to the UK. And I really do, I think, you know, coming back to the Murky Books New Writers' Prize, you know, if something like that had existed when I was 16, it would have really made me think that there's a chance. When I was growing up, I very rarely picked up books with people in them that looked or sounded like me. And I didn't really feel like I could write a story that was reflective of the people that I grew up around. I always thought I had to sort of align the characters and the things they went through in the fiction that I wrote to the Western canon and the books that I was being given at school, you know, Jane Austen and the Brontes and, you know, all of the very like Western canon style. So again, it's why, you know, platforms like Murky Books are so important, because they're actually, hopefully now, plenty of books where kids can go to the libraries and actually see themselves represented and write stories that represent them too. It wasn't something at all that felt like an option when I was growing up. This is the first thing I'd ever written with a Gujarati character in it. It was always stories about white characters, because that's what I was reading growing up.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because, I mean, I've got two daughters, and I always also found that when they were writing, whether it was for, you know, bits of homework or doing some sort of creative writing, they were also writing about in essence white characters. And it was interesting for me then to have that conversation with them and say, you are allowed to write about, you know, things that matter to you, and you're allowed to write about you know, the characters that you can, you know, reflect on and resonate with. And it was like, you know, I could see how their face changed when it kind of dawned on them that, oh yeah, like we can. And I think it's really interesting because it really is about taking up space. And I know, you know, we say that a lot as kind of like people of color, and obviously that does require a lot of energy, but I guess the more we are able to do that and take up space and tell our stories, obviously it should become hopefully, easier, and especially as young people are kind of growing up and, like you said, they're able to see themselves as well. I think the other thing I found really interesting and kind of quite endearing about your debut book, The Things That We Lost, is the relationship that you have between Nick and his grandfather. And obviously the whole book is based on the fact that obviously his grandfather passes away, and that kind of what transpires, I guess, with Nick in terms of him trying to seek the truth and him also trying to deal with so many various aspects of his I guess identity. It made me think of my relationship with my kind of late grandfather, and he lived with us, and I had a very, very close relationship with him, and again it made me think of how I felt when he passed away. I guess the question that came to mind is, we're now living in times where kind of multi-generational households aren't maybe as common. Although having said that, I think maybe because of the cost of living crisis and things, maybe that will start to change and shift again. But yeah, my question really was to you, that how do you think that is impacting society, the fact that maybe young people aren't interacting with, as elders in their family or in their community, and how that might kind of play out in the long run?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because, like you say, especially in lots of South Asian culture, and particularly like Gujarati culture, we do have these sort of multi-generational families and these really, really close relationships with grandparents. And there's a big sort of, there's a huge sort of rhetoric around the idea of service and family and looking after each other. And I know what you mean. I think, as the generations pass and things change, like the grandfather in the book doesn't actually live with Nick and Avni, but again, very typically he lives down the road, which is another thing that happens, Yeah. So they do, for all intents and purposes, see each other all the time. They just don't live together. But I think it's a real shame, I think, when I feel really sad because I speak Gujarati, and the last, the only person left really who I speak proper Gujarati to is my grandmother. She's my only, I've only got one grandparent left. And when she passes away, I often think about the fact that who am I going to speak Gujarati to? How am I going to sustain the language, And it's something I think about. She's very old now, and I do think about that. I think, like, I'm going to lose this sort of touch point I have to the language and the culture. And coming back to your question, I think there's so much joy and warmth and like beauty in those relationships between intergenerational sort of family members. And when I think about myself and my gran, or I think about Nick and his grandfather, like there's so many stories in there as well, I think, which is the most interesting thing to me as an author. There's obviously the thing about language, but there's so many stories from my grandmother's past, and my grandfather too, when he was alive, like, but I would love to have known more about. And I think for me that's the biggest impact of like not sort of living with grandparents or seeing them as often, or when you do lose them, is the stories that get lost with them too. And something that I enjoyed a lot when I was writing this book was speaking to my mum and dad and my grandparents about what it was like when they came to the UK, because I don't know about you, but many of the people I know who came here via East Africa, or even just came here from India and South Asia, was that they didn't really talk about their stories. They were in such a state of like shock and in a state of just having to crack on with it, that they never really stopped to reflect, and they didn't really ever stop to share what they went through. So that's something that I really hope we don't lose. I hope we have these conversations with that generation. I'm really glad I did with my parents and my grandparents, like about their journeys. And a lot of that informed the way I wrote about the characters' journeys in the novel too. And it's something that's come up a lot actually at book clubs, particularly when there are other Gujaratis or South Asians in the audience. You've talked so much about the journey from, these different places to the UK, but why is it that that generation just don't want to talk about it? And I think it's because there's a lot of trauma there. Like, my dad, like the family in the novel, came to the UK months after Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech. What would that have been like? They were told, come to the UK, you're going to be so welcomed, you're going to be naturalized, all of this stuff. And then they came here and there was all of this real hardship that I can't even begin to think about. And they don't ever talk about that time. They just say, it wasn't easy, but we just got on with it. We just got on with it. And I think a lot of that silence around the time is because of the hardships of it and the trauma, if I'm honest with you. So I think mining family histories for, now that time has passed, for what actually went on around that time is something that I think would be a shame to lose,
Yeah, and it's so essential, I think, that we're able to hold on to those stories. And I think what is great is there are kind of different organisations rooted in South Asian stories that are archiving, materials and photographs or whatever it might be. And, it's, again, something I hadn't maybe thought of as much when I was younger, but now I'm getting older. Now I'm kind of a parent and, taking that time to... I also have like one, grandparent left. It's my paternal grandmother. And I mean, she now is... suffers from dementia, but what I'm really glad is before the onset of that, just to have had even just a few conversations, and I'd recorded, audio recorded kind of some of those conversations with her. And you're right, the stories that are there, and it's so important. And for all listeners, anyone who might just be listening, the next time you're on the phone to I don't know, relative. I was about to say back home. I know the word back home can mean so many different things, but, it's so important, just to maybe take that time out and have a conversation. And you're right, so much of it, I guess, was this form of survival because of the trauma. So, completely echoing, what you've said. And again, I guess that's another reason why when we talk about representation and the importance of books, and obviously your book, the Things That We Lost, is, again, it's a testament to those stories, and the fact that it's out there, we're able to, just have it as a companion, I think is really, really lovely as well. So I guess kind of maybe another thing that I wanted to kind of speak to you about is what you mentioned a bit earlier on, because Nick, who is the character in the book, and he's kind of navigating his identity, he's gone from very multicultural kind of northwest London to then in a more kind of white dominated kind of community to study. But this kind of term of multiculturalism, it's definitely evolved, it's become very politicized, and so I want to kind of get your view on what impact that is having now then on kind of immigrant, communities and generations, and what can we do to kind of deal with it, I guess, potentially on an individual level?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. It's something that I've thought about a lot as well, just because, people have different views about what, for example, my family, like I say, have been here since the 60s, 70s, 80s, and we feel very much like, we're Gujarati, but we're British. And I think this is a thing I try to look at in the book as well, this idea of like how much you belong. And it's like a Venn diagram of who belongs where, like how long have you been here, blah, blah, blah. And I think it's really a very difficult one to answer, and a difficult one for me to even think like to try and articulate, because it's, especially with the history of the UK, with all, with empire and the way that so many countries across the world the British went to, and now we're all here because many of us were invited. It's very confusing, because it's like, when I look at my family story, they very much, were living in Kenya, like the characters in the novel. And then when Kenya got independence from the British, they would, they had British passports, so they came here. And it's like, how much do we belong here? And many generations later, how much do we belong here still, even though we feel very British? When I go on holiday and someone says, where are you from? I say London, because I live here and I've grown up here. So it's a very interesting one. And I think it's as nuanced as, a thumbprint is your identity, and how much you feel like you belong in certain spaces. And I have friends who feel very much like they're British, and friends who feel very much like they're Gujarati, and family who feel the same. And it's okay to be all of those things, I think. So yeah, it's a tricky one, and I think identity. This is why I think so many debut writers who are from minority backgrounds do look at identity in their debut novels, because it's such a complex and nuanced thing, and it varies so heavily from individual to individual. Also, how much you perform your identity and the ways you perform your identity, and the ways you do feel like you belong or don't belong.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what you've said about that idea of a thumping is so true, because that really does capture the reality of our individual kind of experiences and how that all kind of pans out. I was just going to say that there's a message from Neelam saying, Assalamu alaikum Imran, and hi to Jyoti. Lovely to hear about your journey to book writing, and I agree with Imrana, it's lovely to read books that resonate with our childhood and culture. It makes growing up in that era seem, in quotes, normal. So look forward to seeing more books on the shelves like this. Thank you so much, Neelam, for your message. And I think actually, Jyoti, kind of carrying on from what you were just saying, and it's something you mentioned before about this idea of code switching. Now later on in the novel, you kind of mentioned this idea of having or putting on a white voice. You kind of speak about the fact that, you know, people of colour had to work twice as hard than, you know, their white counterparts. So do you think that is still kind of exists? Is it changing? And how can we kind of maybe potentially address that inequality that might still exist?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. There's two things there, I think, to separate points. The first one was about like language and, you know, the white voice, etc. And a lot of the novel is about language itself, and the way that, you know, when you do speak two or more languages, you can see, you know, sort of blind spots in one that don't exist in the other. For example, a lot of the novel is about male mental health, and in lots of South Asian languages, including Gujarati, we don't have, you know, specific words for like anxiety or depression or mental health. You know, my grandma will just say tension. She'll be like, don't take tension, as an all-encompassing word for all of these things. And when you don't really have the language to pinpoint something like anxiety or depression or panic attacks, which Nick suffers from, it's almost like they don't exist, and you can't even really understand them or pinpoint them, or let alone begin to think about how to deal with them when you don't have language to describe them. And often, you know, I talk a lot about how if you speak multiple languages, you see these ideas or these things that exist in one that don't exist in another. And it's almost like your whole life experience and your lived experience is different depending which language you speak, you know? And coming back to Nick and his, you know, he talks about how when he's in these very white spaces, he speaks differently to the Northwest London vernacular that we see him use when he's in Northwest London. And that code switching is something that we've touched on earlier, and that we do all the time when we're in white spaces. I speak so differently, you know, when I'm with my friends from Northwest London than I would when I'm doing an event, for example. And we all do this in very subtle ways, no matter where you come from. You know, you talk differently to your grand than you would to your partner. But I think there's an added layer when you are someone who's grown up, you know, in somewhere different to where you end up, basically, or when you're someone who doesn't have the privilege of being, you know, raised in the place that you feel that you belong to. So that's that. And I also, along the same lines, included lots of Gujarati in the novel that goes untranslated. It isn't italicized. There is no glossary, because I wanted Gujarati to exist within this book with as much weight and as much beauty and power as English, because in my mind they're two languages that hold the same weight. So and you know, that's how they exist in the minds of many people who are from the same background as me and the characters in the novel. And it's certainly how the characters in the novel see English and Gujarati. So that was something as well that I wanted to do. I wanted like the form and the way I wrote about these things to reflect the meaning behind what I was trying to say. And I can't remember the second point, actually. I've gone down such a rabbit hole with the first one. But,
no, not at all. I mean, it's just been nice. I guess, no, it was kind of the fact that this idea of also having to work twice as hard. So obviously there's one bit which is the code switching, but yeah,
that was a really interesting point that you made. So when I mentioned that, it's Avni who's at the time she's in the late 90s, and she's in the tech industry. She works as a management accountant and moves up to like a CFO, working in the tech industry. And obviously now the tech industry has got many different kinds of people in it. And, my family work in it and are very successful. And I don't think they would have now had the hardships she faced then. But it is interesting because then you look at, for example, being someone who's brown or black in the arts and, the space there is very different to what it is in medicine or tech or computing because, there are less people who are from, minority backgrounds in higher up positions in the arts than there are in tech and medicine. Do you see what I'm trying to say? So it's interesting, this idea of working twice as hard, because at the time, she would have had to, and it's something she would have definitely felt. Whereas now, I don't know if that would be true. I don't know because I haven't looked into it. But now I expect, like in tech and computing and medicine, like things are different. Whereas in other industries, like film and the arts and music, and I don't know if it would still be a case of you have to really forge your way because the structure isn't there yet. So it's an interesting one. It's something that I felt in my life at certain points when I've been in certain industries. And I think, again, coming back to the identity piece, it's very nuanced and individual to the circumstance. But certainly for her in the 90s, in the position she was in, I would imagine it would have felt like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that's the thing when we talk about things on a kind of systemic level, those are the type of conversation, I guess, that kind of sometimes need to be had depending on what kind of sphere that you occupy. So we are literally, I think, just under a minute away. And I wanted to ask is what is next in the pipeline? Please tell us that there's something that we can kind of look forward to from you.
Oh, thank you. So I am working on the next novel. It's still going to be hopefully like a family dynamic sort of novel, also set in Northwest London, but a very, very different set of characters. It looks like it's going to be a female protagonist this time, sort of in her late 20s, early 30s, just like navigating life. But like I still very much rooted in that British Gujarati, South Asian diaspora. I just have to write it now, and hopefully one day it will be on your bookshelf.
No, and we definitely look forward to that, and I'll definitely have to have you back on the show when that's out. I just want to say thank you so much, Jyoti, for your time this morning. It's been an absolute joy speaking to you, speaking about your book, Things That We Lost. And yes, of course, we'll be welcoming you to Luton a bit later on. So we also look forward to seeing you then. But in the meantime, we are heading over to the end of the show. We were talking to Jyoti Patel about her debut book, The Things That We Lost. Please do get yourselves a copy. I really do recommend it. I think it's really a beautiful story that tackles a lot of like we said, there's untold stories, so it is something I think you will definitely enjoy. But in the meantime, I'll be back, inshallah, in a couple of weeks with a new book and a new guest. So until then, please take care and keep us in your du'as. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Why not tune in to our live stream at inspirefm.org and follow and subscribe to our social media platforms at Inspire FM Luton.